everybody. Welcome to this week's live stream. It's week 5, and today we're going to be covering events in plant evolution. I'm just going to throw this out there now, just in case you guys forgot. I put the Google form link for the extra credit, so you can fill that out about halfway through the live stream. If you do need to go early, just let me know in the chat, and I'm usually active about it. But if not, let's get started. Okay, cool. So, the first part is, how are the events in plant evolution related? One is discussing evolution in vascular tissue. So, mutations in some land plants gave rise to vascular tissue. What advantages did these plants have compared with land plants that did not contain any vascular tissue? So, vascular tissue provided mainly support against gravity. So obviously prior, when all plant life was found in the ocean, they didn't need vascular tissue to help support themselves. But when it came time evolutionarily for them to be on land, the vascular tissue was there to help them. And so because of this, they also could grow taller, which has a lot of advantages in terms of nutrient availability, light energy, and obviously, this is more advantageous as compared to shorter plants who may not have access to light or greater reach of those kinds of nutrients. So as a result, the taller plants, just to answer, other advantages they would have compared to, taller plants would have faster rates of metabolism, they would have faster growth. I'll also write that under taller, so faster metabolism and growth. Vascular tissue allowed for quicker and more efficient transport of water and food throughout the plants. Water, water and food, and it also, kind of just circling back, that more efficient transport of water and food also contributes to the increased potential for faster metabolism and growth. So I'll write that here. Alright, moving on to number 2, evolution of roots and leaves. Mutations in some land plants. Oh, for some reason the sheet is not opening on my Word. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see that until now, so I apologize for not addressing that. I'm not sure what the issue would be with that. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the worksheets through your guys' Canvas and through your professors, so I can't help with that, but what I can do is just send a quick email to the bio professors. Oh, okay, awesome. As long as it's able to open, but I will still make a note of that, and I'll definitely email them just to make sure moving forward that they'll be readily available on those platforms for you. Mutations in some land plants gave rise to roots, leaves, or both. What advantages did these plants have compared with plants that did not contain roots or leaves? Focusing in on roots, some of the advantages they gave were they increased the plant's surface area, and SA is just shorthand, which is ironic because that took longer for me to do, but for water and nutrient absorption. And then leaves provided increased surface area as well. But this is specifically contributed to factors like photosynthesis and transpiration. So just as a general thing, the advantages with roots and leaves together is that cells could now specialize in functions other than just photosynthesis, specifically with the roots and water absorption. Specialize not just in photosynthesis. So this was really critical to plants because now they could kind of, get the nutrients themselves and not rely on that oceanic environment they were in for so long. Water absorption also. Alrighty. Oh, I guess 4 is on the other page. Sorry for not editing this as I intended. 3. The trend toward reduction of the Gametophyte generation. To clarify before I move forward, yes, water absorption, water movement throughout the plant is through the xylem. That is correct. But in terms of absorbing that water from the soil, that's what roots do. So apologies for not being more specific. I was just specifically talking about how the roots function and the uptake of that water from the soil, which they previously were not able to do. But then, yeah, you have different parts of the plant, like xylem, that then take that water that was absorbed by the roots and transport it throughout the plant to hydrate it. It's all connected, so it gets confusing for sure. To discuss, so the xylem, isn't necessarily the pores on the plant. It's xylem is the vascular tissue that conducts the water and the nutrients upward from the root, and it helps form also part of the stem. So it's not actual pores. Yeah, the plant. Got it there. Okay, okay, awesome. Cool. Yeah, plants for me, I've always had a little bit more trouble with as well. They are very, very awesome, but are more complex than they seem, for sure. To define gametophyte for number 3, sorry, we're jumping back. Sorry. For number 3, I just want to define gametophyte so that when we move forward, we're all on the same page and we have an understanding. So a gametophyte is basically they're in haploid form and they have one set of chromosomes, and a gametophyte produces sexually. So you can kind of think about these in conjunction with the ending cells of meiosis, where they are haploid cells that form and reproduce sexually. Beyond that, I wouldn't compare gametophytes, sporophytes to the cells that we were looking at in eukaryotes, just focus on them now, but you can think about them in that way. They're haploid and they reproduce sexually. And haploid is denoted N, diploid is notated with 2N. And yes, for sure. Let me put that in the cool. Alright, so mutations in some land plants gave rise to life cycles in which the gametophyte generation, so this sexually reproducing haploid generation, was reduced. What advantages did these plants have compared to plants that didn't have a reduced gametophyte generation? Reduction of the gametophyte generation within the sporophyte, the advantages is that it actually helped protect the reproductive phase from mutations in the DNA. And let me. Oh, sorry, my page just got cut off. Technical difficulties. Just give me 1 second. Okay, sorry. I have all my stuff back up. I apologize. So reduction in the enclosure of the gametophyte generation helped protect the reproductive phase from mutations in the DNA, which could have been caused by increased amounts of UV or other radiation on land, as compared to an ocean environment. And I'm going to write this down, but I'll explain it a little bit more because I understand the questions of, well, what do you mean by mutations in the DNA? So, protects reproductive phase from mutations such as UV, other radiation. Evolutionarily, always try to go back to the beginning. So when plants are in an ocean environment, they're going to be exposed to less radiation UV as they would on land. And when you are always in the sexually reproducing phase, mutations can be dangerous because there's only one little N here. There's only one guy there. So the mutation in a haploid genome shows up immediately. But in a diploid genome, it can be masked by a non-mutated gene on a homologous chromosome. We talk about this a lot when we talk about eukaryotes and XX chromosome in females. How we can kind of mask certain genes. Let's not make this confusing. Let's not make this sexual. What about just, dominant eye color? We talk about that all the time. If you have two genes, Punnett squares, instead of just one, if you only got one little a, that means you're going to get blue eyes. But if you have two genes there, there's a chance that that mutation is not going to be seen. And so that's what we're talking about here when we say that it protects that reproductive phase, because that reproductive phase is pretty critical when you only have one chromosome that can be carried over. I did a lot of talking, but I will write this down. And let me know at this point if you guys have any questions. Yes, that was the end of my sentence. Sorry. Can you explain two, please? Yes, I totally can. Send that. And, yes, I can totally explain two again. So, evolution of roots and leaves, mutation, and those mutations gave rise to these, and what advantages do plants with roots and leaves have compared to plants that don't? And what we said was that both roots and leaves increased the surface area of the plant, and for roots, the increased surface area meant that they could now perform things like water and nutrient absorption from the soil. So that is, and I'll highlight it here. These two kind of go hand in hand. So the increased surface area that allowed them to absorb nutrients and water from the soil also helped with diversity in their cells, where their cells could specialize in things like water and nutrient absorption. So that's why roots are super important. For leaves, the increased surface area means that they can perform more efficient photosynthesis and transpiration. So the greater, the leaf, the more light that they can take in, the more transpiration they can go through. And so that's why these plants are more advantageous, is because their system is really adapt to living on land. And so they can get all their stuff from the ground and kind of also get all the energy from up top as they were. Does that make sense? If not, that's totally okay, and I can try to explain again. No probs. Yes, so absorption, benefits. Exactly. Exactly, yeah, both definitely do. And remember that the reason why they needed absorption is because they're no longer living in the ocean. We've evolved, now the plants are on land, and so the water needs to come from somewhere, and roots help them get it from the ground, and they no longer need to live directly in a body of water to be able to perform that function and get that nutrient. And this helps with its diversity because now this plant can live in a lot of other places. It's not confined to an oceanic environment. Okay, so now we're going to just move on to 4, which it's very funny that, oh, I don't know why that was the only thing that didn't make it 2. Yep, exactly. So there's increased access to everything based on increased surface area, because the larger surface area, the greater absorption, and there's also surface area on their leaves that can now perform even, they have more room for photosynthesis. So that's exactly right. All right, mutations in some land plants gave rise to the seed. What advantages did these plants have compared with plants that did not have seeds? And I know that this is a lot. Plants can be very confusing, especially when we're dealing with evolution. Things can move fast. So do bear with me here. This is going to have a lot of vocabulary, but I will try to explain all of it as to not confuse you. Try to reference what our definition was for gametophytes in the last question that we did. We said that those are haploid, have a single set of chromosomes, and that they reproduce sexually. So, mutations in land plants gave rise to the seed. What advantages did seeds have? So the reduction of this enclosure of the gametophyte. Oh, sorry. I was reading I was reading the last one. Sorry. Okay. So the seed contains a partially developed 2N embryo, which was the product of the fertilization of the egg by a sperm from the pollen tube. And I think that this is easier to see when it's drawn, so I will do my best. Let's say this is a pretty flower with its pollen tube. And this guy is a little sperm. So fertilization has occurred between these two things. And now we have a seed. I'm just going to call this the seed. And this is a 2N embryo. What this embryo gets in the seed is a store of food for its early development, and a protective coating. So it can survive periods of, it can survive hardships, basically. So there's that coat for protection. And I'll just make this section his food. Their food. Who knows? You know, it's a plant. They don't care. Yes, zygote is before the embryo. A zygote is what, oh, sorry. I just want to look this up so I don't confuse you. A zygote is a diploid cell from the fusion of two haploid gametes. Okay, so sorry, that didn't help, so I looked up something else that would. So the zygote results in the formation of the embryo. So it's what results from a diploid cell of the fusion of two haploid gametes, and the zygote results in the formation of the embryo. So they're kind of like, yeah, they're the same thing. But we use embryo, I think, more for animals and mammalia and that sort of thing. I think that's the only difference, is that zygote is the little plant term for embryo. So thank you, Google, for confusing me. And sorry, you guys. Okay, so this seed is 2N. It gets its own food, and it gets its coat protection. So you can kind of think as the seed as, you know, a little guy with a packed lunch and a raincoat, and they're just set in the world to make it on their own. And so the advantages is that it's a more advanced state of development. And the larger food store allows for longer periods of dormancy. It supports early growth phases following that germination. And I'm just writing zygote equal embryo. I will take that to the grave. More advanced state of development. Food store. This allows longer. Are there any other questions, just as I'm writing these couple points down? And then when germination happens, the food store in the seed actually allows it to also continue and develop. And in this development, it gains roots, stems, leaves until the plant has broken through enough of the soil and can take care of its own. So the seed helps with a lot through the plant's early development and life. That's a really good question. Would the longer period of dormancy allowed them to be dispersed farther? I'm not sure, because also I don't think dormancy would necessarily affect the weight of the organism. So if it were to be dispersed further, maybe that has to do more with its size and weight than how long it's been dormant. Because I think what the main thing is here is just that it has everything it needs, but it doesn't need to use it until the time is quite right. And so it can, you know, munch on food a little, but save that coat so that it doesn't necessarily need to break its shell until it feels it's in a place with enough nutrient availability to do so. But I'm also not sure if that's the definite answer to your question, but that's a good question, I think, to maybe email your professor with, because it's definitely, I'm scratching my noggin over it. And if I think of anything further, I will let you know. Germination is not the sexual reproduction cycle. It is the development of a plant from a seed or spore. So the reproduction cycle is not necessarily involved because it's just about how after those those sexual gametes fused, made a seed, and then germination made a seed or spore, and then germination is just basically that new plant breaking out of that spore or seed. Yeah, of course, of course. All right, number 2. How might these events in plant evolution, 1 through 4, so what we talked about on the previous couple pages, so evolution of vascular tissue, evolution of roots and leaves, reduction of the gametophyte generation, reduction of that haploid state, and evolution of the seed. How can those 4 things be related? For example, which would have to come first in evolution, which next, and so on. Another way to look at this is to consider which of these events paved the way or made it possible for the other event to occur. Be sure to state evidence for your proposed evolutionary scheme. To do this, it is useful to ask yourself questions like these. Would it have been possible for the seed to evolve without vascular tissue first having evolved? Leaves, and so on. If yes, how could this have occurred? If no, why not? All right. So, number 1, because roots and leaves have vascular tissue, then vascular tissue must have evolved first. We always talk about that as the kind of first step onto land. When plants were in oceanic environments, they didn't need to support themselves because the water kind of did it for them. They could just flow, but when they moved onto land, they needed that support within themselves against gravity, and vascular tissue evolved and saved the day. So, vascular tissue evolved first. I'll put in parentheses, roots and leaves contain. Contain vascular tissue. And then now we're looking at the dominance of the sporophyte generation. A sporophyte is diploid, and they have 2 sets of chromosomes. Gametophytes are haploid, single set of chromosomes, reproduce sexually. Sporophytes are diploid, have 2 sets of chromosomes, and they reproduce asexually. So when we're looking at how that the roots and leaves contain I know that the stem and the leaves, mainly the stem, is composed of xylem. I don't believe they're in the roots, but I'm just going to double check because I don't want to give you wrong information. So they actually are throughout the plant. But it takes from the roots to the rest of the plant. So it basically starts at the roots and goes throughout the stem, the leaves, everywhere, and then it distributes the nutrients that were gained by the roots to the rest of the plant. I appreciate your guys' patience when I look up some of your questions. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you accurate information. If I don't know the correct answer. Like I said, plants are also kind of hard for me, so thank you all. All right, Sporophyte generation. It's most likely that this generation became dominant before the seed evolved, and Sporophyte dominance is the same thing as saying the reduction of the Gametophyte cycle. So just don't try to confuse yourself about that too much. Don't think too much about it. It's the same thing. So this probably came before the seed. And this seems most logical because it's logical for the protection of the Gametophyte generation and the subsequent offspring Sporophyte generation. And it's also supported by fossil evidence, which is kind of a big thing. So if I write this down, it'll make more sense. Sporophyte dominance came before the seed. Supported by fossil evidence. And the fact that Sporophyte dominance is logical for the protection of the Gametophyte generation. And what it means when it says subsequent offspring Sporophyte generation, it's just fancy for saying that two gametophytes make these two haploid cells of the gametophytes make a 2N or Sporophyte offspring. And basically vascular tissue came before roots and leaves, and leaves and roots came before the seed. And we know this just because we can sort of think about how much energy it costs to make a seed and distribute an offspring. And so it seems logical that leaves would come after vascular tissue and before seeds because of how much energy it costs to then make these embryos, distribute them, if they can't even support themselves and get the energy from light or get the roots to absorb nutrients. If they don't have easy access to those things through roots and leaves, then it's not easy to make a baby, basically. I'm going to post the form again, just in case. Alright, 3. Incorporate the following true observations into your analysis of how the events in plant evolution, 1 to 4, could be related. The fossil record, spore evidence, and so on, indicates that the first plants on Earth were similar to modern-day bryophytes. A bryophyte is a taxonomic division that contains non-vascular land plants. So this observation indicates that the first land plants were likely to have a dominant gametophyte generation, And we know this because a bryophyte is non-vascular. As we said for question 2, we know that vascular tissue came before roots and leaves came before seeds, and then sporophyte dominance also came before the seed. And no vascular tissue. Alright, B. The very large marine brown algae, for example giant kelp, can grow to lengths of 30 feet or more. These algae have both leaf-like and stem-like structures and are held to the bottom of the sea by a holdfast. When examined microscopically, the algae are found to contain transport vesicles that are similar to phloem in function. These giant kelp do not contain any xylem-like vesicles, however, nor do they have roots. This observation provides evidence for the coevolution of transport systems and in the ocean a food transport system evolved, and so this allowed organisms such as this giant kelp to evolve, and with more efficient food transport, photosynthetic parts of the plant that were closer to the surface were able to supply food to non-photosynthetic parts that were not exposed to enough energy. And just to note that no water transport systems evolved, fitness would not be increased by the addition of water transport systems, all in this case because it's surrounded by water. Yes, I would believe so. I think the main point of the examination of kelp was just to see how transport systems of food and nutrients evolved before the need of water transport systems. And actually, I just looked it up. Sorry. They do not have a definite vascular system. You're right. Every time I look up something and then I re-explain it to you, your comment was correct. Yes, because they're not exactly considered vascular, because a vascular system contains both xylem and phloem, but they do have phloem, so it's just showing the bridge between the two plants. So, exactly. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, jeez. Efficient food transport to part of the plant not exposed to nutrients. Energy source, I should say. Okay, the first land plants with xylem and phloem had no leaves or roots. What this can tell us is that there was a selective advantage to having xylem and phloem alone. And the reason for this is that it allowed the plants to grow taller, and water could just be transported quickly to more distant parts throughout the plant with its xylem. Transport of water. And some parts of the plant could be shaded and not in an energy source, but could still get those nutrients, similar to what we said in Part B. Cool. Oh, sorry, just saw your question. So phloem is what basically conducts food made in the leaves to other parts of the plant. So leaves are exposed to sunlight. They get that energy from sunlight. And then what phloem can do is transport and distribute the sugars that are produced by photosynthesis. D. Some seedless vascular sporophyte plants do not release megaspores. Instead, the megaspore divides on the sporophyte and the old sporangium, you're welcome, to produce the female gametophyte. This female gametophyte produces eggs in an archegonia, which are fertilized by sperm produced in the antheridia of this or other plants. Neither the female gametophyte, once formed, nor the developing embryo receives nutrition from the old sporophyte plant. So this was a mouthful, but basically what it's saying is that we're recognizing how the fusion of these things that together kind of resembles evolution towards a seed, but isn't quite as independent as a seed is. So they still produce eggs that are fertilized by sperm, but it says neither the female gametophyte, once formed, nor the developing embryo receives nutrition from the old sporophyte plant. So the embryo is not equipped with this food store, and it's not equipped with the coat that helps with, periods of non-germination. But this recognizes the transition into a seed that was dependent on a parent sporophyte plant. and how these events could be related. So observations A, C, and D, talking about the dominant gametophyte life cycle with non-vascular plants, the transition into vascular plants when we first see phloem, and also the transitions into seeds, provide evidence of the relationship between all of them. But for when we're looking specifically the fern, for example, that sometimes environmental conditions can select for similar evolutionary solutions. So transport systems in the giant kale were required because it was photosynthetic and it needed to get it to parts of the plant that wasn't exposed to light. But that could have been, you know, a separate evidential solution to those that are also on land. So in this case, the evidence indicates that the effective means of transport are just required for photosynthetic organisms to grow taller everywhere in the aquatic environment and gravity. As we said before, when it's in the aquatic environment, there is no worry of gravity and water availability, and so the only thing that they really needed to figure out was a food transport systems. But on land, that's when plants had to deal with everything. They had to deal with support against gravity, they had to deal with that food transport, but now they also have to deal with water transport. So this is why on land, plants had to evolve different mechanisms than just those that were in water. It also says on my key here to just put a couple bullet points, so I know that I said a lot, but I will just simplify it, and there's also a lot of room of interpretation, and I think the key has a little bit more information as well. Awesome. Alrighty, home stretch. Just a couple true or false. And seeing as we only have 5 minutes, we'll just answer true or false, and I will explain it to you. So 5. The sperm could have been produced by an antheridium, which an antheridium is a male sex organ of algae, mosses, ferns, fungi, other non-flowering plants. So the sperm could have been produced by an antheridium on the moss Sporophyte. This is false. Moss sporophytes produce spores, and Antheridia produce sperm on moss gametophytes only. So sporophytes are 2N. Antheridia is a sperm, haploid. It only forms with a gametophyte, which are also haploid. So that's why that's false. It can't, a haploid cell is not going to sexually produce with a diploid cell. 6. The sperm could later stop swimming and develop into the male gametophyte of the fern. Also false. The male gametophyte is formed when right after the germination of a spore. So that male gametophyte produces the male gamete or sperm. So that the sperm can't just decide to, stop swimming and just produce it. It has to, it's only formed after germination. 7. The sperm may be swimming to the archegonium of the fern. The archegonium is the female sex organ in mosses, liverworts, ferns, other plants as such. And this could be true because sperm from the Antheridia of fern gametophytes fertilize the egg in the archegonium, and that's what produces the diploid sporophyte. And finally, number 8. The sperm could have been released by a pollen tube of an angiosperm, a plant that has flowers and produces seeds enclosed with a carpel. That's what an angiosperm is, sorry. So this is false. No known angiosperms. Once again, this is a flowering plant that produces seeds. No known angiosperms produce flagellated sperm. But just note too that this could be true for some more of the primitive seed plants like cycads, but in general, no known angiosperms produce flagellated sperm. Cool. Okay, that brings us to the end. I know it was kind of a bumpy ride today, so thank you guys for your patience. Are there any last questions before I set you free? Oh, weird. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I hope that you have a lovely evening, that you're doing well this term, getting your stuff done. I know I'm not. Okay. Alright, thank you guys. Good night.